Hello and welcome to The Stack. This week we speak with Elgar Johnson and Jimmy McIntosh from the new men's title, Sir. Country Living celebrates 40 years and a design podcast turned magazine. And also the return of the fashion catalogue. Enjoy the show. From Midori House in London, this is The Stack, 30 minutes of print industry analysis, and I am Fernando Augusto Pacheco. We start the show with a new magazine in town, Sir. The new biannual men's title was created by Elgar Johnson from Circle 08 Media, also publisher of sports title Circle 08. For their first issue, Sir got 5 different covers, including Ray Winstone and Nick Love. I had the pleasure to welcome to our studio founder and editor-in-chief Elgar Johnson and editor Jimmy McIntosh.
I had a conversation, it was a couple of years ago maybe, with Caroline Rush at the BFC, and she was talking about support for men's brands and men's labels and young designers. And she just said that she felt like it was declining and there was a gap in the market for something new. I jokingly said, oh, don't worry about it, I'm going to start a men's magazine and I'll take that gap. And then I started actually thinking about it seriously. And I did start to notice, like, just speaking to friends, and you know, I have a football group chat with like about 150 men in it, and they all talk about different things. And you know, I always watch it. I sort of watch and listen to what they're saying. And one of the things I felt like they were missing was a conversation, someone to have a conversation with. And I thought, well, maybe that magazine is the person to have a conversation with. So I started looking for, like, what would you call it? I mean, what do you call a magazine these days? Everyone's got a name, and it's impossible to think of something. So I came across Sir magazine from, like, I think the 1950s, and it was really rude. It was quite like naughty, like a sort of cheeky FHM, I guess. I was like, I quite like that, and I looked into it, and I was able to get the name Sir for the magazine, and that was it. And that's how it started. And
with an exclamation mark.
With an exclamation mark, exactly. And I love the fact that so many people can be called Sir now. It used to be such a sort of a status thing, really. And now you can go into the barbers and they'll say, you know, what would you like, sir? Or, you know, and anyone can be called Sir. And I like that this magazine can be for anyone. I think that's the whole point.
Jimmy, you're the editor of the title. Issue 1 is out now. I think that's always a special one to have. So tell us a bit more. How was it? Did you work with Elgar before? What was the connection?
Yeah,
here?
So I was working at Circle 08, Elgar's other magazine. Elgar called me up one day, and I worried you were going to fire me or something. because I think I hadn't put anything up online. I was the online editor. I think I hadn't put anything up online. Elgar texted me saying, I want to chat with you. And I thought, oh, bloody hell. But then he was like, oh, do you want to head this men's magazine I've got? And I said, yes. I mean, it's a really beautiful magazine. And we announced it in, September, was it?
I think so, yeah.
And yeah, it feels like it's consumed my life, but in a good way. And yeah, I'm really pleased to have it out now. I hope people are going to enjoy it.
Well, and Elgar, one thing that I noticed, first of all, I really enjoyed reading the first issue. And you can define what Sir is for me, but I felt that it's not London-centric at all. And that's very, very clear to me. And I think that's such an interesting kind of angle to take.
Yeah, I felt like that was a really important part of this whole Sir journey. I didn't grow up. I mean, I did grow up most of my life. I spent in London, but I wasn't born in London. Mm. My mother is from Newcastle and my dad was brought up in Liverpool. So I spent a lot of my time, you know, between Peterborough and the north of England, then obviously moved into London. And throughout that time, even now when I go up to watch Liverpool play and things like that, you know, just through journeying through the UK, it became very, you know, obvious that there was a gap there. And even when I was at GQ, you know, I always also felt, and it's a huge magazine, but I didn't think it was maybe communicating to a certain part of the UK like maybe it should. So I was really conscious about that. And I'm also really aware of what some people may think about maybe the north of England. I think sometimes it can be really patronising. And I was determined to make sure that didn't come across with Sir.
Very good. And one thing I like, Jimmy, as well, the very first kind of page of Sir, I think there's a little intro by Nick Love talking about masculinity.
Yes. Yeah.
That was fascinating as well, because we are hearing so many articles about toxic masculinity, you know, on the newspaper. There are daily articles about that. But I think there's a side of masculinity that people perhaps are not talking about it as well. And I think Sir, in a way, wants to reflect that, right?
Yeah, I think toxic masculinity obviously exists, but it's such a small subsect of men that have those kind of views. There is actually, most of men are just normal blokes who want speaking to, I guess. And it's, yeah, I think men get maybe a bad rap in the media because of a certain minority of people. But yeah, being a man is a beautiful thing, and I think people should be cherishing that.
And it's not quite, so people don't get confused, it's not quite a return of the Lad Mag as well, right? But there, you know, some elements of that perhaps can be incorporated.
Yeah, I think Lad Mags really lost their way towards the end of their run, when it became really about kind of female nudity and, you know, crassness. But the early Lad Mags, there was a cheekiness to it. There was a wit, there was a warmth, which hopefully Sir kind of gets across as well.
You mentioned the warmth. Elgar, I mentioned this to you, the article Talk Gibberish. I thought it was such a fun one. Let's talk about what's your favorite crisp flavor, you know, but in a really cheeky way, as you said, right?
That's what people talk about.
Yeah. I mean, here in the office, they talk about all the time.
Right. Okay. I do. If I go down the pub, like, we talk about all sorts of things. And, you know, people constantly go on about getting men to talk. And the way they do it, I find I actually do find that patronising. I think it comes from a place that people don't understand. Like, it doesn't have to be a serious subject all the time. You know, to get men talking, it is sometimes just about a packet of crisps. and it can turn into something else. And then it becomes something more important. And
very British as well,
absolutely.
You know, that topic.
I mean, this whole thing's very British. I love that all, like, my life growing up. I love Britishness. I think it's really interesting. And yeah, I think there's a lot of things you can play with Britishness, I think.
Humour especially as well.
Humour is really important. British men especially are really funny.
Yeah.
We came across, I mean, I already knew they were funny, but I mean, even just doing this, we came across some people that just made me laugh so much and daft sometimes, just a bit silly. And it's okay to be a bit silly. And just going back to, like, you know, Jimmy's comment about, you know, toxic masculinity, another word I think that's been, you know, grown within the media, I think, without people completely understanding it maybe sometimes. It's like you have to really go some to be a toxic man. Like, you have to go somewhere, because men don't just do that. They don't just turn into that. It's like turning into the Incredible Hulk. Like, you've got to have some sort of serious issue there. So for everyone to be sort of tarnished with the same brush seems a little bit unfair. And I hope, and yeah, and we would never put someone that's an idiot in Sir. Who wants that in the magazine anyway? But we're not going to stop celebrating being a man at the same time.
Absolutely. Well, and talking about celebrating a man, let's talk about the cover stars. You know, I think there are 5 different covers, right?
Yes, yeah.
So tell us about the man you guys picked up for the cover. Maybe, Jimmy, what can you tell us? Because that's the first issue, so they're literally a representation of Sir in a way, right?
Yeah, I think they all speak to different genres of men, I suppose. You know, you've got a kind of the older geezer in Ray Winston. It's like a younger geezer with big love. Yeah, I think we wanted to do a really broad spectrum of man, and I think all 5 kind of did that. What do you reckon, Elgar?
of man,
broad spectrum of man. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we did. I think we just went after everyone that we thought. You know what? We didn't think that deep about it. It was just people we liked, if I'm being completely honest. And I think that's okay to just do things you think are good. It's as simple as that.
And remind us, our listeners, it's going to be a biannual title, right?
It's going to be a biannual for now.
Ooh, I like that. I like that.
Yeah, for now.
Even the fashion is different because, you know, I remember your work at GQ Style. You're really kind of, you know, you were talking about sportswear when perhaps was not that cool at the time, you know. I think now it's kind of, you know, I think most magazines learned. But tell us about what is the fashion at Sir? What's the fashion coverage there?
I think it's about, for me, it's going straight to consumer. And I think this is one of the things that maybe has hindered brands in, you know, now, because they're not showcasing their clothes in a more, I can't say sensible way, but in a way that opens up to everyone. I want people to be able to wear a suit and just wear a suit and look good in it. And that's it. It was about looking good. It's not about, I'm not creating art here. You know, it's about styling men and making men feel like, you know, if they like that T-shirt, they can go and get that T-shirt, or they can get a T-shirt that looks like that T-shirt. It's about, you know, getting clothes onto men. But also, can I make a point, like, putting clothes onto men that I want to be as well. Like a lot of the models in there, I'm like, oh, they're so handsome. Like I want to be like them. And that's how we all think. It's just, it's not about like, well, let's get the quirkiest person we can find and put them in the magazine, because it doesn't really, it represents a really small amount of people, I think. One of the things we say about Sir, well, I've said about Sir the whole time, is that if you buy it, you'll be better looking. And it's as simple as that. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek, of course it is, but you probably will find something in there that you want to wear. You'll probably find a fragrance that you want to buy to smell good. And, you know, there's all these different tips to make your personal style better. So the styling and the fashion sense is more real. You know, there's a realness about it. Anyone can look like these guys, and I think that's really important.
I like the consumer side of things as well, because you think of Japanese magazines, you know, sometimes it's very important. They shoot a T-shirt, you can buy it. You know, it's not like the T-shirt is not hidden in a crazy kind of, space.
Brands need that now, I think. You know, I think they hedge their bets. Certain brands hedge their bets on being very avant-garde. And the everyday person couldn't just walk into a shop and buy a plain jumper anymore. It had to come with something else. And that's a really small market.
Absolutely.
People look great like that, by the way. But I mean, I would love to be able to wear those. But unfortunately, I don't.
Shall we talk a little bit about, you know, Circle 08 as well, which is the brand new issue is just here.
It is.
Almost an exclusive, if you can say that. That's your second magazine, right, Elgar?
Yeah, so that's my baby. So I look at Circle 08 as like, she's like the mature sister. And then she's got this little pain of a brother that's come along. So it's a beautiful magazine. It's a contemporary sports magazine. And it's, you know, using sport as a vehicle to communicate art, film, music. And it's such an interesting journey. And, you know, you don't have to be a sports fan to love it. You know, it's stories. And they're not stories about how did you get here in your career. It's stories about things that maybe the athlete doesn't get the opportunity to talk about. And it's just a really interesting read. I feel very proud of Circle 08. I think sport scares a lot of people. I think when you mention sport, people go, oh, I was never picked at school. And it's just like that dread comes to people's sort of mind. And I think this is almost like a peaceful release for people to read.
Amazing. And one thing I want to ask you, because magazines more and more I hear here on the Stack, you know, they talk about the physical presence, that they have to do events, you know, that they have to connect to the readers. Is there any plan in such a way for Sir magazine, do you see?
I think everyone has to be able to do that sort of event thing now. It can't just be old-fashioned sort of print advertising. People want so much more. And you know what? I actually prefer it that way. It brings it to life. If you have an event, you get people there, and it's like, it feels like they're living it with you. And I think that is really important. It's
world building, right?
And it's not exclusive. It's like, it's open. I
think with Sir, I don't want to speak for you, but I certainly always want to build a world that you can kind of buy into, but you can be part of. Like, I think in my editor's letter, I think I say, you know, you're one of the club now. You are a Sir. And I think it's really important to connect with the consumer, or just with people. I don't really like the word consumer, but with people in that way. And a good way to do that is through, community events and, just getting them involved. You don't want something too distant. You don't want to feel like an unobtainable thing for a lot of people. I really want Sir to be for everyone, really.
Thank you, Elgar and Jimmy. And the first issue of Sir is out now. And so is issue 7 of Circle 08. And now it's time for a party. Country Living is celebrating 40 years in the UK. Since the summer of 1985, the magazine attracted loyal readers with its chirpy tone and the best on homes, decorations, crafts and gardens. The title also added specials to their rosters: Country Living Modern Rustic and Country Living Vintage Home. It was a pleasure to welcome to our studio Country Living's editor-in-chief, Louise Pierce.
I've been editor-in-chief for 7 years. But I've been working with Country Living on and off really since its launch 40 years ago, out of a sister publication called Good Housekeeping. And I was working as a very junior assistant at the time on Good Housekeeping magazine. And I remember the team who were assigned to launch Country Living. And I can remember as clear as anything, as if it were yesterday, the moment the first issue arrived in the building, and how excited everybody was. And really, the rest is history. And then after that, I worked on and off for many years as a contributor. Susie Smith, my predecessor, edited the publication and the brand really for 25 years. And I worked a lot with her on and off when I was freelance. But it's the last 7 years that I've really been involved and been, if you like, the custodian of the brand.
That's amazing. And for me, country living is all about the slow living, this lifestyle. In a way, it makes it feel so current as well, right? Because that's all we want, right? In a way.
It is. It absolutely is. I mean, the editorial ethos is really the same today as it was when we launched, because it's a beacon really for people who want to live a slower, simpler and more sustainable life. And everything that we do, all of our content really is geared towards that. As you say, it's so relevant today. We noticed actually in the pandemic that a lot of people, as you probably remember, moved to the coast. And we noticed a lot of the younger generation also kind of turned away from the 9-to-5 office life because they wanted to live differently and they wanted to embrace nature and the countryside, and also to kind of live maybe in a more self-sufficient way. And all of those things are things that we champion and celebrate at Country Living. So in many ways, as you say, it's very current at the moment, very relevant to all age groups, all demographics.
I would agree. And even reading an article from the June issue, which is how can you plant to attract butterflies? I mean, that's exactly what I needed, actually. So thank you very much for that.
Yes. Gardening for wildlife is such a big topic. And we call it sustainable gardening now, because we know that people are looking to garden in a more eco-friendly way. They're looking at investigating things like no-dig gardening, for example, things that are kinder to the climate and to the environment. So those kind of articles, you'll find in our magazine and online, because that's the sort of stuff that we know our audience want to read about.
Of course, you have, a great digital presence, but what's still the importance of your print title? I mean, do you have those subscribers who say, I don't actually go to the website, but I just want my print copy every month?
Absolutely, we do. Absolutely. It's really interesting. We ran a reader event last autumn at Le Manoir 4 Saisons, the hotel and restaurant that's owned by Raymond Blanc. And our readers flocked to it. It wasn't an inexpensive event, but they loved it. And they wanted to come because we included a lovely garden tour, which appealed to very many of them. And many of the people there were probably in their 50s and 60s. Some of them retired, some of them semi-retired. But they all loved the magazine, and they are a tribal following, really. And they typified the magazine readers that we have. And we talked to them about our digital presence. We talked to them about the things we're doing. And some of them said to me, I'm not interested. I like to read it in print. I love the magazine arriving. They're subscribers. I love it arriving on my doormat. And I savour it. And, from month to month, that's what I do. So don't talk to me about digital because I just want to talk to you about your magazine.
And one thing about Country Living that I noticed, you love print because you publish beautiful specials. I have two of that in front of me, Country Living Modern Rustic and Country Living Vintage Home. I mean, if you don't mind to talk a little bit about Modern Rustic, because I think such a beautiful title. It is part of the country living world, but there's a sense kind of aesthetic, perhaps a slightly cleaner aesthetic, like there's a big picture on the cover. What can you tell us about those specials and why have you decided to launch then in the first place?
It's interesting, Modern Rustic. You're absolutely right. With Modern Rustic, it does have a slightly different aesthetic. And we're working at the moment, I think, on either version 27 or 28 of Modern Rustic. It started in around 2017. And the reason that the team wanted to start it was that they felt there was a real desire and need to see slightly more contemporary houses that sort of didn't necessarily sit and fit in the aesthetic of the existing magazine, where the style was slightly more kind of eclectic, a little more vintage, a little bit more of mixing old and new. And this cleaner aesthetic we were seeing, and the team was seeing more and more, and they decided to launch this publication as a spin-off. And it started really just focusing on UK houses with a much cleaner barn-style houses, that kind of industrial look which was, very modern at that time. That's how it started. But it's actually become a curation of international houses now and has a real cult following. It does incredibly well in America. And as you say, it's a very visual product printed on beautiful matte paper, which we love. And it gives us that chance to really showcase the most extraordinary and adventurous houses and the land around them. They're often big houses, not always, but often big houses. So we went from focusing purely on UK houses to focusing on houses in Australia, in Greece, in Italy, in South Africa. And the following has grown, and the product has kind of grown with that following. So we love that. And Vintage Home is our other product, which publishes once a year. And that's a very different thing. It's a very much, if I was to say in 2 or 3 words what it's about, I would say it's about make, do and mend. It's one of those...
Very current.
Yes, absolutely. It features a lot of kind of ideas for upcycling, for mixing things up. Lots of stories on collectibles for people who enjoy collecting things like ceramics, old teapots, compasses, all sorts of things, old glass. So it's all about, it's set out really for people who enjoy collecting things and mixing it up in their home in a kind of old meets new way. But both products have been incredibly popular. And as I said, they sell well here, but they also sell very well in America.
Amazing. And I want to talk to you about covers as well. For example, especially let's start with the magazine Country Living. What does sell if you put it on the cover? Are there any specific colors that you have to use or the cover lines? I wonder, how is the process of choosing the cover?
Goodness me, that's a question to ask.
We
do it so instinctively, but we always know what a Country Living cover is and what it isn't, which I guess is a sign of being a good creative director or a good editor. I think the thing about Country Living is the drumbeat is really the seasons. The seasons dictate what goes into our magazine and to some extent what goes on the cover, because we work with the seasons. So, if we're featuring or looking at our March cover, for example, daffodils may very well be considered. And we might look at buddleia or other kind of plants or flowers as we get into summer. But it's important to have colour. And I think one of the most important things is joy. We want the covers to bring a sense of joy to the reader. We're all about embracing nature, embracing the joy of outdoors. The covers are not always outdoors. Sometimes they feature really beautiful kind of living rooms or something. But joy is the thread that kind of runs through every cover. They need to have a feeling of being lived in and a sense of kind of an evocative, an emotive kind of stance.
Especially on the June issue, because it is the celebratory edition celebrating 40 years, right? So it's quite a chunky one as well.
It was a big issue for us. And, 40 years is a good amount of time to have been on the newsstand and reaching to subscribers. Many of the subscribers, of course, have been with us since day one. And they tell us, they hold our feet to the fire, quite rightly so, about what we're doing. So this was a big issue for us to bring together. And, we wanted to really celebrate. We've got a campaign running this year called My Green and Happy Space. And we brought that together in this issue because we wanted to really kind of celebrate what it's like to be, how it feels to be connected with nature. And over the years, we've interviewed so many people, from adventurers to authors to actors, who have talked about how nature has helped them and how it has sort of boosted their well-being or helped them overcome illness or given them a sense of balance in their life. So a big part of this issue focuses on, we've gone back into our archives and brought out some of those interviews and those people who've spoken to us over the years about the importance of nature in their lives.
Amazing. And I also love there's an article comparing 85 with 2025 as well. There was some fun kind of comparisons in there as well.
I found that really hard actually to look at, because I sort of remember that era so well. And Vicky Carlisle, our editor, worked on that story hard. And I found it quite difficult to make decisions about what should go in and what shouldn't go in. But it was a fun piece. And again, a piece that I think a lot of people will enjoy looking at.
And I want to ask you, well, not necessarily all the numbers, but one thing I noticed, if I go to a proper newsstand or if I go to my local Tesco, I think it's a brand that is there. It looks like you have quite a large kind of number of print issues around. It feels to me that it's doing very well.
It is. We don't have to talk numbers because they're boring, but we're doing well, and we have a very loyal subscriber base. So, we have a lot of people who subscribe to our publication, across our channels and our way of life, really. That's what they're really subscribing to. But yes, we are always on the newsstand, which isn't the case with every publication. It's quite often hard nowadays to find some publications on the newsstand. So I'm very pleased that we have such strong presence. And that's very helpful. It really helps us to keep our brand buoyant and out there and visible, which is incredibly important in this day and age.
And finally, I just need to mention that the modern rustic cover as well, fantastic. That couch, I need to go and buy it. It's beautiful.
Thank you.
You mentioned there was a risk, right? Perhaps there was not as much color as expected from you guys.
Yes, it's interesting. We had somebody take on the design this issue who really wanted to push the creativity. And the cover is quite brown. It comes from a house inside, which is very kind of tonal browns. And it's a departure for us, I think, for modern rustic. Not so traditional. We'd normally feature perhaps a little more texture, maybe an exterior of a building, maybe a view out of a window. But this is very much, it's a very simple cover with a curved sofa in a room. And I think it's quite a brave cover. I'm so pleased you like it, because we've yet to see, it's just out, we've yet to see performance. But I have my fingers crossed that pushing it in a slightly more contemporary direction will be a good thing.
Thank you, Louise. The June issue of Country Living is out now, and so is issue 27 of Country Living Modern Rustic. And now we feature a new print title that started as a design podcast. The Grand Tourist. The founder Dan Rubinstein just published their first ever print issue. It's a tome of 364 pages, including the best of their most recent season of the podcast and art, design, travel, and style. I spoke with Dan about the podcast and how the magazine came about.
The Grand Tourist started as a pandemic side project during lockdown, during the pandemic. And as I now like to joke, it was either finger painting or a podcast, and I decided to do a podcast. And for that first season, I had this really super high concept of where everybody is locked inside, and there was something about the nature of media and design media at the time that was really kind of flattening everything to an Instagram post or something quick on a blog. And I really wanted to bring back that long form profile of people in style and design and art and collecting and lifestyle, and, let these kinds of interviews breathe for 45 minutes to an hour. That's how I came up with the idea of the Grand Tourist. A Grand Tourist is someone who went on a grand tour, as many listeners probably know, was something that, in the latter half of the 18th and for part of the 19th century, where if you were a gentleman or a gentlewoman of means, you would go on essentially what was a 19th century gap year and go on a long voyage from possibly England all the way through Europe down into Italy and go into Rome and study architecture and art. And you would, study language, probably sow your wild oats and see something of the world, because people obviously didn't travel that much back in the day. And so for young people, it was a way of, seeing the world, becoming a more educated, erudite person before you came back to your estate or whatever, let's say back in the UK, to kind of like run a business, get married, get settled down, and possibly, be presented, as a single person and try to before you had your real life. So the Grand Tour begat the Grand Tourist. And so the Grand Tourist is really about appreciating all of these different aspects of life and taking them in a way that is, informative and deep, and not something that you just kind of reduce to an image or anything like that. So we did the first season very much during lockdown, and we did 12 episodes, and then that was successful. And then we did another one, and then it was like, oh gosh, then we got to plan a whole year of episodes. And that's how it kind of quickly became a full-time job. At the time, I was the home and design director at Departures magazine, which sadly sort of, shut down during the pandemic. We had already done all of my interviews for that first season already. So I just kind of ran with the ball. And years later, we built a website, and then we did a newsletter and kind of refreshed all of that. And people just kept wanting more and more content. And that's what led us to the magazine.
And, you started with print and then you moved, of course, to podcast and now you're going back to print. But what do you think is so special about podcasts, especially when dealing with topics like you do, style, design, travel? Do you think is this kind of human connection? As you said, you wanted something that could breathe, that could be a little bit longer, you can really get to know the person you're talking to.
Yeah, the podcast and the magazine are really one and the same. I was speaking with somebody in the industry that I really respected when I was coming up with different ideas for projects. And I was kind of going through all of these different ideas and different formats and stuff. And they were just like, the medium doesn't really matter anymore. It's really about the message. And so I really took that to heart and found it to be totally true. And so the magazine really is a three-dimensional version of the podcast. Just like the podcast is for a niche audience. I like to say, if you know who Axel Vervoort is, then it's the podcast for you. And it's not necessarily designed that would apply to, just about anyone, just trying to redecorate their summer home or something like that. Like, it really is about a very particular niche, which I think if you're in the design world, sometimes you kind of assume that everybody knows who Robert A.M. Stern is, but really no. Actually, it's a quite niche audience, and that's what my sponsors and all of my different partners really admire. And so I'm using the same kind of thought with the magazine. It's an oversized linen cover. It's a hardcover book, essentially, with multiple different, cover designs, and it's 364 pages. We assigned basically every photo shoot in the entire magazine is commissioned by us with contributors from all around the world. So we really wanted to give it the same sort of love and care and attention that we talk about on the podcast, because now I've done over 130 episodes at this point, and we're starting season 13 in just a few weeks in May here in New York. And so, yeah, it's really kind of a reflection of that. It is Q&A based. It is deep conversations. I've shown some advanced copies to some people, and one of the immediate, bits of feedback is they're like, oh, wow, there's a lot to read here. And there really is. Like, when you're doing a story and it's running over 12 or 20 pages, like, you really can get into in-depth conversations. And we also have all of the podcasts from the previous season are collected into this edition with, commissioned portrait shoots and different studio visits and things like that. So it is, the podcast and the magazine are kind of completely overlapped. It'll change the way that I think about the podcast in the future.
That's fantastic. So that's what I was going to ask. At the beginning, did you knew in your head there will be actually a magazine? Maybe I'm not just quite there yet. Or was it something that you thought maybe in the last year or so?
No, it was literally in the beginning. I was like, I will never, ever do a magazine again. This is fantastic. I love this. But over time, I started to miss the opportunity to generate work. And I think like print media is still the last place where you can really commission work, whether it's illustration, photography, a real voyage from a writer or a contributor. It just opens up a whole world of creativity that I loved exploring with the podcast too, in my own way. But really doing something in print is still this sort of last bastion of that kind of level of slow, well thought out, beautiful, commissioned work. People have tried to do digital magazines, and it really just, in the end of the day, you need something in print. And what I find fascinating is, I've worked in magazines for 25 years, and I started my career at the American version of House and Garden, and was then at a magazine called Surface for many years as the editor-in-chief, before I eventually found my way to Departures. And it's funny to see like a new generation of photographers. We work with people I've worked with in the past as well, who are more probably my age. But there are a lot of working with young photographers that maybe that started on Instagram, have never been in print. And they don't really know what that's like. They've never done it before. And that's been really thrilling. And also to see, photographers, especially young photographers, wanting to go back to film and wanting to experiment with things like that has been really gratifying to see.
I want to talk about the look of the magazine. You said hardcover, 364 pages. It's incredibly chic, the covers I've seen. Tell us a bit more about the design. There are a lot of kind of beautiful illustrations. It is like a work of art in that sense.
Thank you. Thank you. A lot of that credit goes to my collaborator, Matthias Ernstberger, whose studio is called Me and Friends. And we worked together at a previous magazine where he was the creative director, where I brought him on board. Matthias is a really fantastic talent. And it's so great to work with someone that you've known for so long. And he's one of the few people on earth I would trust with an initiative as big as this. He worked for Stefan Sagmeister as a young man for one of those 7-year cycles that he does. And after we worked together on a magazine, he went to Coach and David Yurman. So really understands the worlds of like fashion and jewelry and marketing and all that stuff. So a lot of the credit goes to him. We spent months kind of really figuring out what the format of the magazine was going to be. I think today, if you do anything in print, the physicality of the object is really, really important. And it has to be a part of your entire publishing strategy as well. So, you know, when you look at other magazines that are highly successful, let's take Cabana, for example, their sort of fabric cover strategy and the physicality of the whole thing is such a big part of it. And so with The Grand Tourist, I wanted to make sure that the interviews and the personalities of the people that I was interviewing really came through in our covers. So we have 3 different covers, each with a different colored linen. The images are tipped in, meaning like they sort of press into the linen, and then the photo is sort of put, you know, sort of glued into the cover. Even our back page ad is the same technique. And then we also have, you know, cover lines that are hand drawn by our illustrator, Zebedee Helm. And, you know, on the other cover lines and things like that in the masthead are all embossed. And so it's really focusing on putting that whole thing together was, you know, so important in terms of like thinking about what is this magazine and what is inside. Once we had that figured out, and we also knew that, listen, everybody in the podcast was going to be in the magazine. And that kind of dictated, okay, you're talking about a lot of portraits, not necessarily a lot of vistas or rooms or things like that. So you want something more vertical, and you want something that's efficient, and you want for the printer, and you have all these like different requirements, and we wanted it to be big. We didn't want it to be small. We wanted it to be something that someone would have on their coffee table or in their library for a long time. And one sort of thought process led to another, and that's how we kind of wound up where we were.
And I think these days, as well, you're talking about, you know, the importance of print. I think even financially, perhaps it makes sense, because in the first issue of the magazine, you have incredible advertisers there as well. So did you had a relationship with those brands, and maybe they knew the podcast and they trust your work? So there was already like a knowledge about you and what you do.
I would say about 60%, if not more, of the clients and the partners that we had in the first issue were previous partners of the podcast. So for a lot of people, they were like, well, normally we would want to see a few issues before, but we know you, and we know we've already done business with you. So we know we're going to see something really unique, and we trust you. And so that was a big part of it. And so having the podcast was a nice primer in terms of like knowing me, knowing the business, and also knowing the kind of caliber of the people in the magazine. So at this point, after I've done 130 episodes, you know, if I'm talking to someone in design and they're like, well, why should I do this podcast? And I'm like, well, you know, John Paulson, David Chipperfield, Bob Stern, Bjarke Ingels, I could go on, like in terms of Pierre Jovanovich, blah, 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 blah. I could list dozens and dozens and dozens of people that have been on it. And so that gives a certain sense of familiarity and trust. And so I think that kind of bled into the magazine. I don't know of other podcasts that have started print magazines quite like this. So I don't know if I'm the first, but I think it's probably something that's going to happen more and more as, you know, podcasting has exploded, and it's
usually the reverse, right?
The pandemic.
Like Monocle, of course, a magazine, and then, you know, we also do podcasts and
correct,
and we have a radio station. But the reverse actually is true. I mean, it's rarer. I hope it happens more often.
I hope it happens more often too. I think like there are so many new print projects floating around in the world of like art and design and style. Most magazines, you know, I've studied magazines for so long, and I remember there was an old adage that like 90% of magazines don't make it right past the 5-year point. And it takes 3 to 5 years for most magazines to become profitable. So, you know, that's foremost in my mind. Like I'm not, you know, this is not my first rodeo. So I know exactly where I wanted to put the emphasis and my energy into every issue. Now that we've done one issue this year, we'll become biannual next year. And so I'll already be planning for the next 2 issues at the same time, probably this summer, and, you know, dive back in. But we're also going to make sure that the print magazine and the podcast will dovetail more than ever. And so that overlap will make more sense, and we'll adjust the schedule of the podcast to kind of click with the print edition.
Thank you, Dan. And you can buy the first edition of The Grand Tourist on thegrandtourist.net. And finally on the show, our lovely fashion director, Natalie Teodosi, celebrates the return of the fashion catalogue.
Headlines in the luxury retail sector suggest fear and uncertainty, particularly in the US, where famed department store group Saks Global is struggling to execute its turnaround plans. Yet when you step off the world's great shopping avenues, a quite different story presents itself. In London, a few minutes away from the hustle and bustle of Oxford Street, a jewel box of a boutique, Coybird, has curious passers-by dropping in to discover its edit of independent designers. While in New York, one of the best shopping addresses is now located on Brooklyn's unassuming Atlantic Avenue, where locals in the know shop new season items from luxury labels like The Row and Dries Van Noten, as well as independents like Beirut Super Yaya. Running an independent boutique involves risky investments with little guarantee of turning a profit. This is why over the last decade we've seen the eclipse of the multi-brand boutique and the concept of curation itself, only to be replaced by shop-in-shops operated directly by the big luxury groups. The return of the boutique highlights an urge for discovery and connection. It's no longer about convenience above all else. In fact, retailers are discovering that a little inconvenience doesn't hurt sales. It's why opening shops in quaint neighborhoods has become increasingly popular, and so has the printed shopping catalogue. This spring, both Coybird in London and Outline in New York announced plans to shutter their e-commerce sites completely, sending physical catalogues to customers instead. You might no longer make a purchase with a few clicks, but you can submit your address online and receive a beautiful printed catalogue that features the shop's seasonal buys. You can flick through all the different looks and place an order by visiting the boutique or texting the sales team. In the case of Outline, whose catalogue was shot in a modernist Brooklyn home, there's even a section for taking notes as you peruse. This focus on tactility is tied to founders Margaret Austin and Hannah Rike's refreshed vision on what it means to run a successful retail business, serving the neighborhood with one excellent shop rather than updating a website on a daily basis and aiming for bigger numbers. "We're tired of doom scrolling," Rike told me when visiting the shop. "There's way too much product out there. It's almost like going grocery shopping." But it seems that the pendulum is now swinging. The return of the catalogue could easily be dismissed as a one-off marketing experiment steeped in nostalgia, not unlike the brief revival of early 2000s fashion and gadgets like CD players. But it might also signal the return of a more mindful way to shop and a more human-centric approach to luxury.
That was Natalie Teodosi there. She wrote for the Monocle Minute, which you can subscribe on monocle.com/minute. And that's it for this week's show. My thanks as ever to our editor, Jack Jewers. Any comments or queries, feel free to write to me, Fernando, at fb@monocle.com. And remember, we're back next Saturday at 10 a.m. London time. Meanwhile, you can always listen again at monocle.com or subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You've been listening to The Stack. I'm Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Until next time, it's goodbye from me.